This man is the king of the West Coast, from a humble beginning to becoming a notorious drug lord. He is well known to be the guy of Pablo Escobar. As his empire grows, he faces the exhilarating highs and devastating lows of a life immersed in the dangerous world of narcotics. Hello, welcome back to IM Movies. Today we're looking into the 2001 American biographical crime drama film called Blow. But before we jump into the details, make sure to show us some love by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Now let's get right into it. The movie begins with George Young, a young boy who lives with his parents in Weymouth, Massachusetts. George's father, Fred Young, runs a plumbing and heating company, but as time goes by, the company cannot sustain the family's needs. Moreover, George's mother, Ermi Jung, isn't helping matters, as she constantly nags and complains about how Fred can't provide for his family. On several occasions, she'd left the house, but Fred always accepted her back. When George is 10 years old, his father, Fred, files for bankruptcy, losing everything he'd ever worked for. On that very day, George asks Fred if they are going to be poor, and Fred explains to him that money isn't real, and that no matter what happens, life goes on. However, George decides there and then that he'll never be poor in his life. Fast forward to 1968, teenage George and his childhood friend, Tuna, move to a beachside in California with just $300. Soon, they begin to make new friends at the beach, and that's where they meet Barbara, a flight attendant. Realizing that marijuana is a highly sought-after substance at the beach, they decide to venture into its business, and Barbara introduces them to Derek Forreal, a saloon owner and marijuana dealer. Now, with Derek's help, George and Tuna begin to sell marijuana on the beach, and they soon begin to live large in California. One day, George and Tuna meet one of their old friend Kevin Dully, a visiting college student from Boston, who tells them that there's a growing demand for quality marijuana back home. George suggests the idea of expanding their business venture to campuses in Boston to Derek, offering him the possibility of making $15,000 each week, and he agrees. Soon, Barbara begins to move 100 pounds of marijuana in briefcases through flights every week. However, each time Barbara delivers the briefcase to Dully, he asks for more. With the increase in demand, George decides to start using trucks to move his merchandise. But as a business owner, you start to calculate the amount of money you could have earned more if you go directly to the source. That's when George decides to find a supplier from Mexico. In 1969, they all went to Mexico, looking for where to get marijuana. Finally, they meet Santiago Sanchez, a Mexican drug lord who deals majorly with marijuana. George tells Santiago that he wants to buy all his stash of weed, but Santiago laughs it off as a joke. However, George promises to fly a plane in the following week with $50,000 in cash to pay Santiago off, and he agrees. The following week, George, Dully, and Tuna steal an airplane and fly it down to Mexico. Seeing that they kept their promise, Santiago welcomes them, and George even impresses him by adding an extra $25,000 to the initial $50,000 promised. With the help of Santiago Sanchez, a Mexican drug lord, they start moving large quantities of marijuana with planes to meet up with demands, and they make lots of money. In 1970, George buys Barbara a house in Mexico, and they all begin to live a groovy lifestyle. Shortly after, George introduces Barbara to his parents as his fiancée. However, in 1978, George was arrested in Chicago with 660 pounds of marijuana and then was charged to court. The judge slams George with a $20,000 bail and the option of 5 years in prison, but George tells Barbara that with the help of his lawyer, he'll only serve 2 years. However, Barbara reveals to George that she can't wait for 2 years as she has been diagnosed with terminal cancer. With this, George decides to skip bail to take care of Barbara until her death. After Barbara's death, the whole gang broke up, and George, who's now a fugitive on the run, visits his parents and decides to spend some time with his dad. Hours later, the cops arrive, and they arrest George. However, he later realizes that his mom had tipped them off as she begins to yell how disappointed she is. George gets sent to a federal correctional institute in Danbury, Connecticut, where he meets Diego Delgado, his roommate who is in prison for car theft. One day, Diego tells George that he'll be free in 9 months sipping champagne in Medellin. However, George still has 26 months of jail time. So, Diego advises George to teach classes in order to get his time reduced. Now, if some of the inmates can get their diplomas, George will get his sentence reduced. However, the inmates refuse to learn anything from George, stating that he's only doing it to get his time reduced. So, George decides to make a deal with them, stating that if they agree to help him get his time reduced, he'll teach them how to move drugs. However, one of the inmates suggests that George knows nothing about moving drugs, so George tells them how he ended up in prison for moving 660 pounds of weed from Mexico on a plane. Later that night, Diego tells George that he can help him reach his dream faster, promising to help him get into the cocaine business, which is more profitable than marijuana. Soon, George and Diego begin to exchange ideas on how to move drugs across borders. After 16 months, George becomes a free man, but on the condition that he lives with his parents and gets a job. But shortly after George gets out, he decides to contact Diego, who then invites him over to Cartagena, Colombia for his first cocaine business deal. Immediately, Diego introduces George to Cesar Rosa, another drug dealer who wants George to move 15 kilos of cocaine for him to establish good faith. George manages to successfully move the 15 kilos of cocaine across the US border, and they decide to step up their game. George introduces Steven, a pilot, to Diego and Cesar, as they now plan to move 300 kilos into the US using Steven's plane. Cesar promises that his El Padrino will pay $3 million for every successful delivery they make. They all agree that Stevens gets $2 million since he'll be doing all the work, while Diego and George get to share $1 million. However, Diego's girlfriend is not happy about it, and she begins to fight him. Later, Diego locks her in a room and asks George to help him pick up 50 kilos of cocaine, stating that their just concluded deal with Cesar is just a small part of the business. George gets to the pickup location, and as soon as he mentions Diego's name, the cartel boss grabs him and puts a gun in his mouth, stating that Diego should have picked up the cocaine about 3 weeks ago. Days later, George gets a call from Diego, who is now in Colombian prison, asking him to find a way to sell the 50 kilos. 3 days later, George reconnects with Derek in California, and they both sell off all 50 kilos in 36 hours. George finally delivers the money to the cartel boss in Miami, and they take him to Medellin, Colombia. Here, George meets with Diego, who's now out of prison as a result of Pablo Escobar's influence. Pablo requests to meet George alone and welcomes him to Colombia. Pablo begins to praise George for being able to sell 50 kilos of cocaine in just 3 days. Then Pablo tells George that he needs an American that he can trust with his merchandise. Subsequently, he proceeds to ask George how much he'll charge per kilo, and how many kilos he'll be able to move. But George insists on discussing it with Diego first. Shortly after, Pablo agrees to do business with George and Diego. With the help of Derek, who George keeps as a mystery man, the duo soon become Pablo's top US importer, moving cocaine to almost every major city in America. Soon, George and Derek made so much money that they didn't have enough room to store it. Subsequently, they decide to put their money in a Panamanian bank, since it's the same bank that Pablo Escobar used to store his cash. At Diego's wedding, George spots a lady staring at him from a distance, and he approaches her. While they are talking, Cesar joins them and introduces the lady, Mirtha, to George as his fiancée, and then excuse them. However, Mirtha and George keep staring at each other all through the party. Meanwhile, Diego, alongside the other cartel bosses, continues to pressure George to reveal his American mystery man to them, but he refuses. That same day at the wedding, George and Mirtha both have an affair, knowing that no one can touch him since he is Pablo Escobar's guy. Shortly after, George's affairs with Mirtha soon turn into a business partnership, and they both eventually tied the knot. One day, Diego begins to yell at George, questioning why he's decided to keep his American connection a secret from him, but chooses to reveal it to his wife, Mirtha. Diego bitterly expresses his concerns as he reminds George about how he helped him get into the business. Later, some cartel gang comes to pick up a delivery, but Diego won't stop yelling at George about how he feels. During this heated argument, George gets shot in the shoulder by one of the cartel guys. After they leave, George reveals to Diego that his contact is Derek for real and later introduces them to each other. One day, George meets with one of his fellow drug dealers, Augusto, who reveals to him that Diego and Derek are now partners. Realizing that he's been cut off from the connection, George decides to confront Diego about his betrayal, but Diego defends his actions, stating that he brought George into the business, introduced him to Pablo Escobar, and got nothing in return. However, George pulls an empty gun on Diego, and Diego orders his men to beat him up. George manages to get home that night, and Mirtha begins to cry, seeing how badly they hurt him. That same night, George promises Mirtha that he's out of the business and has no intention of going back, stating that he has decided to focus on taking care of her and their unborn baby. However, George still gets hooked on cocaine, and even has a heart attack from an overdose during Mirtha's child labor. Inspired by the birth of his daughter, Christina Young, George stops doing drugs, and all goes well for 5 years until Mirtha organizes a 38th birthday party for him. Many of his former drug associates attend, including Derek, who reveals that Diego eventually cut him out too. However, the FBI and DEA raids George's party and arrests all the guests, taking his wife and daughter into protective custody. After signing a deal with the FBI, George once again violates his bail terms and soon becomes a fugitive on the run. Subsequently, George visits his parents to tell them he'll be away for a while, but his mother refuses to speak to him. After that, George visits the Panamanian bank to get his money out, but he soon realizes that the bank is no longer under the same management, and that his funds have been appropriated by the Panamanian government. Now, George is left with nothing to take care of his family, and Mirtha begins to complain about how broke they are and keeps hurling curses at him. One night, Mirtha and George get into a fight while driving, and they get pulled over by the police. However, Mirtha reveals to the police that George is a fugitive and a cocaine dealer, stating that he has a kilogram of cocaine in his trunk. Subsequently, George ends up in jail. 3 years later, Mirtha visits George in prison to tell him she's divorcing him and also taking custody of their 9-year-old daughter, Christina Young. Upon his release, George struggles to rekindle his relationship with Christina, as she has now grown to resent him. However, George manages to get her to forgive him, and they soon become close again. With this, George promises to take Christina to her dream destination, and she chooses California. George tries to earn some money in order to keep his promise, so he does one last drug deal with Derek and Dully. The operation goes smoothly, but George realizes too late that the deal is a setup by the FBI and DEA to get him with the help of Derek and Dully, who were seeking to reduce their sentences. George gets arrested and sent to serve 60 years at Otisville Correctional Facility in upstate New York. The betrayal and arrest didn't bother him much like the promise he had just broken, and he finds it hard to forgive himself. While in prison, George requests a furlough to see his dying father, Fred, but his mother denies him access. However, his lawyers allow him to record a voice message to his father, recounting the memories they had together while he was growing up, stating that he now understands what Fred meant when he said money is not real. George grows old in prison, and he gets visited by Christina, and he marvels at how big she's grown. However, he later realizes that it's all in his imagination as she fades away as a guard calls for him. And the movie ends here. If you'd like to see us recap any other movies or topics you have in mind, just drop a comment and let us know. And don't forget to hit the like button, share this recap, and subscribe to stay updated for the next one. Until next time.